So I asked you all how you're doing today earlier, and I want to ask you another question. This is slightly deeper. Are you ready for it? How's it going with sharing the gospel with others? Okay, that was some of you kind of looked down a bit. It's the reason why I knew I would get that kind of reaction is because sharing the gospel with others is hard, isn't it? And here are some reasons why. We personally feel that we're not the right people to do the job. Let someone else do it. I'm not clever enough or wise enough to do this. Sometimes we feel perhaps my knowledge of the Bible is simply not good enough. But that's only one aspect. Quite often, we look at ourselves and just feel we're not the right people to be doing this. We're not smart enough. We tend to think, what if the person responds quoting literature that I don't know, or philosophers I've never heard of, or discusses alternative belief systems I don't know the foggiest about. We simply don't feel adequate for the job. We also feel that we socially may not be adequate. We think she is not going to listen to me. I'm a first year in college while she's a third year. Or I'm not respectable enough in my boss's eyes to share the truth. Some people will even just looking at themselves feel that they don't demand the respect they should have from others, and therefore they won't share it. Some people will even think they're too ugly, and therefore, who's going to take them seriously when they look like that? So the first reason is we feel personally inadequate. The second is quite often we worry about the message. We worry that the message is going to come across as lame or perhaps not even helpful. And sometimes we will even want to edit the gospel or edit the message because we feel that this is not going to work. A man dying on a cross 2,000 years ago is supposed to help someone with their problems. We sometimes tend to think, yeah, right. Sometimes you feel that with so much scientific understanding and psychology in the world today, the world is flooded with information on how the world works and how to live in it. Put that stuff next to the gospel, and the gospel just perhaps seems like a bit of a joke. We feel daunted by the task of sharing the message that we feel might be inferior by today's standards. And there's other reasons as well, like timing. Sometimes we feel that timing isn't right to share the gospel and things like that. But I picked these two reasons that I've told you about because in today's passage, it shows us, firstly, that Paul identifies with us. He agrees that the gospel sometimes appears foolish. Secondly, his messengers are actually not the brightest sparks in the room. The people that he uses to share the gospel are not often the best, appears like to be the best people for the job. Yet, God uses the seemingly foolish message shared by inadequate messengers to change the world. So the first thing we're going to look at is the foolish message. That's the first point. It says this in verse 18, if you want to read with me, it says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are being called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. See, in verse 18 it says that the word of the cross, or the message of the cross, seems foolish. But it's not foolish. It's only foolish to those who are perishing. In other words, those who don't believe. And then later on he says why it appears foolish to the unbelievers. In Corinth, in verse 22, he says that Jews demand signs and the Greeks seek wisdom. So what he's doing here is he's breaking up the Corinthian people into two groups. You've got the Jewish people and the Greeks. And he makes some startling statements about their character. Let's break it down. The first thing he says is that the Jews demand signs. So in order to understand this, you need to understand the culture. Now, the story of the gospel of God is God sending his chosen king, his son, to come to earth, to die on a cross, but then not to stay dead, to rise again so that whoever believes in him can have eternal life. That's the gospel right there. The biggest problem that the Jews would have had with the gospel is that God's chosen Messiah would die on a cross. You see, to them, it was not just difficult to believe, but scandalous. In Jewish law, anyone who dies on a tree is cursed. That comes from Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23. So in their eyes, how can God's blessed king be cursed? To them, that comes across as an oxymoron. It's like saying a married bachelor or a square circle. How can someone be blessed and cursed? To top this off, the Jews believed that when the Messiah would come, he would come kind of like a WWE wrestler entering the stadium. You know when a WWE wrestler enters the stadium, everybody in the stadium knows, right? Because the music blares, they have a song that's specifically for them, the lights shine bright, they're even oiled up so that they shine. And the Jews believed that when this king enters the world, he's going to enter in a super obvious way, like that wrestler coming in. There's going to be super obvious signs. The whole world's going to know about it. He'll come in his chariots with bright shining armor, and his enemies will fall before him like grass to a lawnmower. They expected signs like massive 5-story billboards. Instead, Jesus arrives like an A5 flyer. He comes in humility. An A5 flyer is really small, if you didn't know that. He doesn't come with glitz and glamour. He comes as a baby born, not on a throne, but in a stable on dirty straw. And he's raised in a backwater town of Bethlehem, where in Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, but raised in Nazareth. And everyone basically says about Nazareth, no one good ever comes from there. And instead of ascending the ranks to eventually leading over huge armies, he descends the ranks to become lower than any human by dying a brutal, horrific death on a cross. He's a far cry from what the Jews were looking for, because they were looking for the signs. But they weren't the signs he was showing. The Jews were looking for signs of him being a dominating lion, but instead the gospel message is of a sacrificial lamb. So you can see why the gospel is a stumbling block, as verse 23 says, to Jews. Because when they hear it, it goes against their understanding and they dismiss it. The second thing is the Greeks seek wisdom. Now, the Greeks back then actually had a word to describe the gospel. They called it moria, which is, you might have guessed it, is where we get our word moron from. They basically looked at the gospel and they saw it as moronic. They saw it as stupid. See, they believed that God is the unmoved mover. He is above all, and therefore he's above emotion, above pain, and certainly above death. Now remember, these Corinthians, they were thinkers. They followed guys like Plato and Aristotle. They didn't see the cross like we do. You know, when we hang this cross, I've actually got a cross on my neck, but it's gone behind my t-shirt here. I often wear this cross. But we look down at this cross and it reminds us of our salvation and of the hope and the relationship we have with Christ. We see the cross, we think Jesus. When they saw the cross, they saw an execution device. Something that was reserved for the scum of the universe. To them, the idea that a God who cannot be moved, who is above all creation and therefore above pain and death, would die on a scum's wooden pole was just inconceivable. Now here's the problems for these Jews and Greeks. Although it appears folly, this message, verse 18 and 20 tells us that it's salvation for those who believe. In fact, verse 18 reminds us that those who see it as folly will perish. And we'll say, verse 20, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? See, we can see the cross as foolish, but one day we're going to die and be before him and realize then that it wasn't foolish. On the judgment day, when we are faced with eternity, we're going to realize that in comparison to eternity, this life on earth just feels like seconds. And all the wisdom that we had on this world was just that, a few seconds of good thoughts. That's why verse 20, has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? That's why it says, and here's the application. How are you dismissing the gospel? Because if you are, you may be dismissing it kind of like a Jew or like a Greek. Are you like the Jews and you're looking for signs? You have a picture of how this Jesus should deal with suffering, and when he doesn't, you dismiss it. When your picture of him doesn't match the real thing, when the signs you are looking for don't appear, do you dismiss the gospel? You will say things like, if he's really God of this world, why doesn't he just come down to me and tell me face to face? Why isn't he around today sorting out all the problems of the world? If he's Jesus and he's really loving, then why did he let my mom die? See, we have our signs that we're looking for. And if he's not ticking off the boxes, we don't bother looking further into the gospel. We'll dismiss him. We come face to face with who Jesus is in the gospel, but he's not what we want, so we throw it away. Some of you might not be Jews, but Greeks. Some of you might be here today, and in your eyes, the gospel has just always appeared foolish. Perhaps you're an intellectual mind and you feel this gospel is not for the intellectual mind. This is child's play. You probably feel that Christians look a lot like children who believe in Father Christmas. Jesus is just a nice thing to believe in, brings warmth to our hearts. But come on, a man walking on water, dying and coming back to life, honestly. Christians, grow up. Well, if this is you, then no matter what you read of the gospel, you'll dismiss it because it's foolish. You'll say, it's not for smart people. The problem is, what if it's true? The consequences are too dire, aren't they? See, if you believed in something like atheistic evolution, which is the idea that evolution happens without divine guidance, then the consequences of that is just that you die and you become dust. But if Christianity is true, then it means that if we don't give our lives to Jesus, our eternity is far worse. We spend eternity in hell. The consequences are far worse than just being dust. But the consequences of if it is true and you do trust in them is also far better, right? Because you have eternity with him. So I urge you, don't dismiss the gospel because the message sounds lame or Jesus is not what you expect. Look deeper into it. At least try and do everything you can to prove that it's not true before you dismiss it. Because the consequences of it being true are far worse. So we're going to look at the next point now, which is the foolish messengers. So not only does the message seem foolish, but so do its people. Look at verses 26 to 28. He says this, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are." Now the calling there means that they were called to be followers of Christ. And through their lives and their teaching, God uses their lives to shame the wise. Paul goes on from verse 1 to 5 of chapter 2 and says, he did not come himself with lofty speech and wisdom when he first came to the church in Corinth and shared the gospel. When he came to Corinth and shared the gospel. In verse 3, it says that he actually came to them in fear and trembling. Now, why would Paul, a man who spent much of his life teaching in front of crowds and who was a great academic because he was a Pharisee in his past, why would he say that he didn't come with lofty speech? Well, here's another moment where we kind of need to understand a bit of context here. See, Corinth was known as a city of wisdom. Now, you might think that would mean that it was filled with philosophers. Perhaps on each street corner there were people reading academic works or meditating. But actually, for the Corinthians, wisdom was more of a sport. It was a public performance. Paul Barnett, who is probably one of the best commentators that I've read so far in 1 Corinthians, explains that the Corinthian people had 3 major things that they idolized or saw as of utmost importance. And it was this: the subtle arguments of Socrates, the physical elegance of the goddess Aphrodite, and the raw power of an Olympic athlete. In other words, they valued great arguments, beauty, and power. Or to summarize, beauty, brains, and brawn. Now, there was this mass entertainment that they had called Wisdom of Words, where spectators would gather to watch people debate, like we would gather to watch a sports match. But here's the thing: they didn't care if what the speaker said was true. They cared about how it sounded. They cared about the performance. Was the argument elegant? Did the speaker have a rhythmic flow? Was he commanding? And if you had the polish, then you had the power. It was all about the veneer. In other words, people watched the debates, and whoever appeared to have the brains, the beauty, and the brawn, that's the team that they would shout for. It didn't matter what was really said. It didn't matter if it was true or false. It mattered about how it appeared. Kind of like many people today who are attracted more to TikTokers and YouTubers who have slick, polished videos and are great orators and sound convincing to the point that we love listening to them, but we barely ever check if what they say is actually true. Anyway, the context helps us to now understand Paul's comments. The town is intimidating. When he came in to first share the gospel, he came into a city that was filled with great orators and people who were only interested in brains, brawn, and beauty. That's daunting. You can understand why he's shaking in his boots. No matter how lofty his words of wisdom are, it will never be as lofty as those guys who deliberately use big words that no one understands just so that they can appear powerful, brilliant, and look good. And Paul's not the only one who's intimidated. The Corinthian Christians are too, for he says in verse 26, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but here's the best part. And here's the part that warms my soul. Verse 27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. See, although the messengers are fools, God is not. And he uses weak vessels to shame the strong. God used a man, in fact, an old man, and a woman, too old to have kids. These two people were Abraham and Sarah, to give birth to a nation. He used a man with a speech impediment, a guy called Moses, to lead thousands of Jews out of Egypt. He used a boy to defeat a giant. The point is, God can take something weak and make it shame the strong. God can take what is low and despised in the world, even things that are considered nothing, which is actually a better translation of verse 28, and use it to make nothing the things that are. This is simply showing God's power. See, the point is, if you think you are not good enough to be used by God, well, don't fret, because God will even use nothing to make a massive change in the world. You might often look at yourself and say, God could use someone so much better than me. God could use someone who is better looking than me, who has a better way with the words, who when they speak, he or she commands a room. But that's brains, brawn, and beauty. You know what you're doing? You're relying on yourself. You know what? When you live for Christ, when you stand up and share the gospel, you are walking with the Lord and he shines through you. He gives you the words you need. He empowers you. You know, the gospel message, think about this. The gospel message, it started with a carpenter who died on a tree. And his leadership team were a bunch of fishermen. Yet 300 years later, his message took over the whole Roman Empire. If God can do that to the lowly of society back then, he can still do that to the Morania, which is you and I now. And that doesn't mean when you go out and share the gospel with people are just going to get converted. We've just seen in the first part of this talk that people respond differently to the gospel. What it does mean is that you go out putting your best foot forward. The last and final point is the genius of God in using the foolish. So why does God do it this way? Why do things upside down? Why be so opposite to those Corinthians who valued prestige and loftiness by using the lowly and a seemingly foolish message? Surely the gospel would be spread more easily if the message didn't seem so foolish and the message giver was great, a great and flashy orator. Chapter 2, verse 4 and 5 help us here. Verse 4 says, this is Paul talking again, and he says, my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. In other words, his speech and his wisdom came across as foolish so that people didn't trust him, but trust God. Lewis Hamilton and Michael Schumacher are two of the greatest F1 drivers in history. They've both been F1 champions 7 times. But you know what would make them even greater than they are now? Is if they each won 7 times, but they did it with the slowest car on the track. See, God is great. But what makes him even greater is that he takes no one's, with a seemingly foolish message. And he's ended up using that to make the biggest religion in the world. That shows his power greater than if he did it with the best people in the world. Paul, knowing this, said, that's why I didn't speak with plausible words of wisdom, because I wanted you to see God's power. I wanted you to see that God could take a short, stubby man, like we know Paul to have been, and with my ill-eloquent speech and my seemingly foolish message, and it could change your life. You know, if he had come looking like Chris Hemsworth with flashy speeches, people would have only had eyes for him and not for his God. And they'd listen for a while until a flashier, better speaker came along. See, our weakness is actually our biggest advantage, because it makes people see past us to our God. In your weakness, God is glorified. This means that if you are in college or in the workplace and you are afraid to live for Christ or to share the gospel, you know that God's looking at you and he's saying, just watch me cook. Now, this doesn't mean that you just get lazy and not give God some good ingredients to work with. You should be in God's word. You should join a connect group. You should be working hard at growing in God. But all your physical inabilities, all your flaws, they become nothing when God is in the kitchen. One final thing to say on this as we close is we often want to edit the gospel or change it to make it more flashy. As preachers, we're often tempted to even do things like, you're going to laugh at this, but this is true. A lot of preachers actually feel this temptation. They want to dress cooler because they think if they look better, people will listen more. Churches want to change the aesthetics. And it's good to make sure that the church building is not a barrier to the culture, but someplace that is warm and inviting. But man, if our aesthetics and our good looks make us think that that's what's going to convert people, we've got another thing coming. And if we feel tempted to change the gospel, well, we're doing the wrong thing, aren't we? And it's hard. Sometimes you feel that challenge. Even you, when you're sharing the gospel with others, you feel you don't want to tell people that they're sinners. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say. It sounds almost offensive. But then that's us trusting us to make sure we know what the prettiest picture is of the gospel. We're not trusting the actual God of the world. So I want to encourage you to hear today, if you're with us today, I want you to see that God has entrusted you with this foolish message. And I know it sounds offensive to call a church Morania, but we're all morons. Yet God can use us because He is the God of power. He is the God who's changing this world. He is the God who's making His message go out. Let that challenge you to share the gospel. Let me pray. Father God, we just thank you so much for your message. We thank you for your truth. We thank you that though this message appears foolish, it's really not. In fact, you have called it the gospel is the wisdom of God. Help us to not see it as foolish, to see it as your wisdom, and to be bold in living it out. Pray this in your name. Amen.